World War I is most often associated with the Western Front trenches, barbed wire, and battles like the Somme, Verdun, and Ypres. These battles, fought between France and Germany, have become the iconic images of the Great War. But beyond this infamous battlefield, there were other fronts that saw intense combat, where soldiers fought in conditions as grueling as those on the Western Front. These forgotten fronts are often overlooked, but they were critical to the war's outcome, and their stories are essential to understanding the global scope of the conflict. One such front was the Eastern Front, where the armies of the Central Powers, primarily Germany and Austro-Hungary, fought against Russia. The scale of the conflict here was staggering, stretching from the icy wastes of the Baltic to the vastness of the Russian steppes. Unlike the stalemate of the Western Front, the Eastern Front was defined by rapid movements and large-scale battles. Soldiers on both sides endured freezing temperatures, logistical nightmares, and diseases that ravaged their ranks. The sheer size of the front made it impossible to control effectively, and battles were often fought across vast distances with few supplies. To the south, the Italian front marked another pivotal but often overlooked theatre of war. Italy, which had entered the war on the side of the Allies, faced off against the Austro-Hungarian Empire along a mountain range in the Alps. The terrain was rugged and treacherous, with narrow paths, snow-covered peaks, and sheer cliffs. The battles here were defined by brutal alpine warfare, where soldiers fought in freezing conditions, often with little shelter or food. The Italians launched several offensives, such as the Battle of Caporetto in 1917, which was disastrous for them but offered important lessons in the future of warfare. In the Far East, the battlefields of the Middle East became another forgotten front. The Ottoman Empire, allied with Germany, fought against British and Commonwealth forces, primarily in regions that now encompass modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. The war in the Middle East was a complex one, shaped by both traditional warfare and emerging tactics, such as guerrilla fighting. The British relied heavily on local forces, including Arabs and other groups, to rise up against their Ottoman rulers. Key campaigns such as the Gallipoli campaign in 1915, the Sinai and Palestine campaign, and the Arab revolt against the Ottomans became defining elements of the Middle Eastern front. These lesser-known battlefronts were far from forgotten by the men who fought on them. The Eastern and Italian fronts saw appalling casualties and hardships that rivaled or even surpassed those in the trenches of the West. Yet, the stories of these fronts often remain buried beneath the more famous accounts of trench warfare and the war to end all wars. But it is on these forgotten battlefields that we see the full scale of the global conflict and the human cost of a war that stretched across continents. While the Western Front dominated the attention of most war historians, the Eastern Front was a theatre of war that spanned a much larger area. The sheer size of the conflict in the East was staggering. It stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south, and from the German border in the west to the vast, snow-covered steppes of Russia in the east. It was a conflict that pitted the Russian Empire against the combined forces of Germany and Austria-Hungary, with the Central Powers aiming to break the Russian military and end the threat of the Eastern Front. Unlike the entrenched positions of the Western Front, the Eastern Front saw more fluid, mobile warfare. The Russian army, despite its size, was plagued by logistical issues, poor leadership, and inadequate supplies. In contrast, the German and Austrian forces were better equipped and often more strategically sound. Battles were fought over immense distances, with vast supply chains stretched thin, and soldiers constantly on the move. The Russian army faced severe setbacks early in the war. In 1914, the Central Powers launched a series of offensives that decimated Russian forces in battles like Tannenberg. The Russian army was ill-prepared for the speed and effectiveness of the German tactics, leading to catastrophic losses. But Russia, despite its struggles, was able to put up stiff resistance in the early years of the war. The presence of harsh winters, vast forests, and unpredictable weather added to the challenges both sides faced. The Eastern Front saw some of the most devastating battles of World War I, including the Brusilov offensive in 1960. General Alexei Brusilov's strategy, which involved a combination of deception, infiltration, and concentrated attacks on weak points in the Austro-Hungarian lines, was highly effective and resulted in significant Russian victories. However, the toll on soldiers was immense, with tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. It was one of the bloodiest offensives of the war, and its success was marred by the internal disarray and eventual collapse of the Russian war effort. In 1917, the Russian Revolution further complicated the situation on the Eastern Front. The collapse of the Tsarist regime and the eventual rise of the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin shifted the focus of Russian priorities from fighting the war to internal political turmoil. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918 effectively ended Russian participation in the war, as Lenin's government negotiated a peace agreement with the Central Powers. The Russian withdrawal allowed Germany to shift its focus entirely to the Western Front. Despite the withdrawal of Russian forces, the Eastern Front had already played a crucial role in shaping the course of World War I. The staggering losses of life, the vast, unforgiving terrain, and the suffering of soldiers are often overshadowed by the battles of the Western Front, but the significance of the Eastern Front cannot be denied. It drained resources, caused immense suffering, and forced both the Russian and Central Powers to divert critical attention and forces away from other fronts. When Italy joined the Allies in 1915, the country was hoping to expand its territory at the expense of Austria-Hungary. The Italian front became one of the more brutal and challenging theatres of war, as it was fought along the rugged terrain of the Alps. Unlike the flat, muddy landscapes of the Western Front, the battles in Italy were fought in steep, mountainous areas, often at high altitudes. These extreme conditions made warfare especially grueling for the soldiers who had to contend with not just enemy forces, but also the harsh environment itself. The Italian army, initially under-equipped and poorly trained, faced a formidable enemy in Austria-Hungary, which had its own well-entrenched positions along the mountains. The Italian soldiers had to battle the Austro-Hungarians through a series of offensives and counter-offensives that stretched over thousands of miles of treacherous terrain. The Italian army also had to contend with severe weather conditions, including snowstorms, avalanches, and freezing temperatures that made movement and supply lines incredibly difficult. The most famous battle of the Italian front was the Battle of Caporetto in 1917. The Italian army suffered a catastrophic defeat at the hands of a combined German and Austro-Hungarian force. This battle is often seen as one of the most devastating for Italy, as it led to the collapse of their defensive lines and the retreat of their forces into Italy itself. The battle was a disaster for the Italians, with more than 300,000 casualties, many of whom were captured or killed. The defeat at Caporetto forced the Italian military to regroup and reorganize, and it had lasting effects on Italian morale and strategy for the rest of the war. However, the Italian front also saw some remarkable feats of resilience and bravery. The Italian army, despite its setbacks, was able to stabilize its positions in the aftermath of Caporetto. In 1918, the Italians launched a successful counter-offensive at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, which was decisive in breaking the Austro-Hungarian forces and contributed to the overall collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The victory at Vittorio Veneto, although overshadowed by the larger events on the Western Front, was crucial in the final stages of the war. The terrain of the Italian front, combined with the intense, close-quarter combat required by the mountainous warfare, led to horrendous casualties on both sides. Soldiers often fought in freezing temperatures, trudging through thick snow and dealing with the constant threat of landslides, artillery barrages, and snipers. Many soldiers lived in caves or makeshift shelters, enduring not just the dangers of war, but also the isolation and exhaustion that came with it. Despite the lack of major victories for Italy for much of the war, their determination and ability to resist played a significant role in the eventual Allied success. The Middle Eastern theatre of World War I is often overshadowed by the more famous European fronts, but it was a crucial battleground in the collapse of empires and the reshaping of the region. The Ottoman Empire, once a powerful and sprawling empire, entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. Its vast territories stretched across parts of modern-day Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Palestine, and these areas became key locations for both Allied and Central Power operations. One of the most significant campaigns in the Middle East was the Gallipoli campaign of 1950. The Allies, seeking to secure a route to the Russian Empire via the Dardanelles Strait, launched an amphibious attack on the Gallipoli Peninsula in what is now Turkey. The objective was to capture Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. However, the campaign quickly turned into a disaster for the Allies. Despite initial landings, the harsh terrain, poor planning, and determined resistance from Ottoman forces, led by Mustafa Kemal, later Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey, turned Gallipoli into a bloody stalemate. More than 250 1,000 men from both sides were killed or wounded, and the Allies were forced to retreat, leaving behind a legacy of failure and a surge in Ottoman nationalism. Despite the setback at Gallipoli, the Middle East remained a critical front in the war. The British, aiming to weaken the Ottoman Empire, focused their attention on the Mesopotamian region, modern-day Iraq, and the Sinai Peninsula. In 1916, British forces, under the command of General Edmund Allenby, began a series of operations in Egypt and Palestine, aiming to push the Ottoman forces out of these strategic areas. The campaign in the Sinai Desert and the capture of Gaza marked pivotal moments in the war, but it was in Palestine where the British, aided by Arab nationalist forces under T. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, would find their most significant successes. The Arab Revolt, which began in 1916, was a key turning point in the Middle Eastern theatre. The British had promised independence to the Arabs in exchange for their support in overthrowing the Ottoman Empire, and many Arab leaders, particularly Sharif Hussein of Mecca, embraced this opportunity. Lawrence, working closely with the Arab forces, conducted a series of raids and guerrilla warfare operations against Ottoman supply lines and communication routes. These tactics, combined with the mounting pressure from the British forces, eventually forced the Ottomans to retreat from Palestine and Syria. One of the most famous battles of the Middle Eastern front occurred in 1917 at the Battle of Beersheba. Here, the British mounted a cavalry charge, one of the last successful cavalry charges in military history against a fortified Ottoman position. This victory allowed British forces to advance into Palestine, culminating in the capture of Jerusalem in December 1917. The capture of Jerusalem was seen as a significant moment for both the Allies and the Jewish community, fulfilling part of the British promise made in the Balfour Declaration, which supported the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. As the war progressed, the Ottoman Empire's hold on its territories weakened. The British and Arab forces continued to push northward, eventually reaching the Ottoman heartland in Anatolia. The final defeat of the Ottoman Empire came in 1918, when British forces, with the support of local Arab militias, captured Damascus. The Ottoman surrender marked the end of the empire that had ruled much of the Middle East for centuries. The Middle Eastern front not only contributed to the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, but also laid the groundwork for the modern political landscape of the region. The collapse of the empire led to the establishment of several new nation-states, including Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, and the division of Ottoman territories by European powers. The legacy of these decisions continues to affect the geopolitics of the region today. While Europe, the Middle East, and Asia received most of the attention during World War I, there were also significant, albeit often forgotten, battles fought in Africa and the Pacific. These battles were crucial not only for the colonial empires involved, but also for their strategic implications in the larger global conflict. Though these theaters of war are often overlooked in traditional histories of WWI, they were far from inconsequential and offered a unique perspective on the global nature of the war. In Africa, the war was primarily a series of colonial skirmishes between European powers and their empires. Germany's colonies, especially in East and West Africa, became key battlefields in the global struggle. At the war's outbreak, Germany controlled several territories in Africa, including German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda, German Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, and Cameroon. The most famous African campaign occurred in German East Africa, where German General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck led a remarkable resistance against the much larger British and Allied forces. The German forces in East Africa were vastly outnumbered, and they faced logistical challenges that were unimaginable to the combatants on the Western Front. Yet, General von Lettow-Vorbeck utilized guerrilla tactics, leveraging his deep knowledge of the terrain and local support to wage a prolonged and highly effective campaign against the British. His forces were a mix of German soldiers, African askaris, local soldiers, and porters, and they waged hit-and-run attacks on British supply lines and outposts, creating havoc and stretching British resources thin. The British, along with their colonial troops from India and Africa, launched several large offensives to crush the German resistance, but von Lettow-Vorbeck's forces continued to retreat into the vast interior, winning key engagements and evading capture. This campaign lasted until the end of the war, and the Germans did not officially surrender until November 1918, long after the armistice was signed in Europe. This prolonged resistance in Africa showed the broader scope of the war and the resilience of colonial forces, who fought a war far removed from the European front lines.
Far from the fighting in Europe, the Pacific was another theater where World War I saw action. Germany's Pacific colonies, including German New Guinea, now part of Papua New Guinea and other Pacific islands, were among the territories targeted by the Allies, particularly Australia and Japan. The Allied powers, eager to seize control of Germany's Pacific possessions, quickly launched operations to capture these islands. One of the most notable actions in the Pacific was the capture of the German colonies in the Pacific by Japan. Japan, having entered the war on the side of the Allies, seized German-controlled islands in the Pacific, including the Marianas, Carolines, and Marshall Islands. These islands would later become key strategic points in the Pacific theater during World War II, but in WWI, they represented a show of power by Japan and a significant shift in the balance of influence in the region. Japan's successful capture of these territories demonstrated its growing strength as a world power and its ambitions to control key areas in the Pacific. Meanwhile, British forces and their dominions, including Australia and New Zealand, focused on seizing German-controlled territories in the South Pacific. In 1914, Australian and New Zealand forces launched the capture of German New Guinea, securing it for the British Empire. These relatively small but strategic operations contributed to the broader Allied war effort, though they often went unnoticed by the general public compared to the battles in Europe. These Pacific and African campaigns demonstrated that World War I was not confined to Europe. Instead, the war touched every corner of the globe, drawing colonial powers and their empires into the conflict, whether in the harsh deserts of Africa or the tropical islands of the Pacific. These lesser-known fronts were vital in securing Allied victory, providing both strategic advantages and valuable resources that played a role in the larger global struggle. By 1918, the war was all but over. The Central Powers were collapsing, and the Allies were on the brink of victory. The war had devastated Europe, shattered empires, and caused irreparable damage. However, the aftermath of World War I did not mark an end to the global conflict, but rather set the stage for the upheaval that would follow in the decades to come. One of the most immediate consequences of World War I was the collapse of several long-standing empires. The Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German empires were either dismantled or severely weakened, their territories divided among the victorious powers, or left to fall into political chaos. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had been a patchwork of different ethnic groups, broke apart into several new nation-states, including Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire, which had been a dominant force in the Middle East for centuries, disintegrated, leading to the creation of modern Turkey and the division of its Arab territories, which would later be shaped by the influence of European powers, particularly Britain and France. The Russian Empire, having suffered both military and political collapses, gave way to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, leading to the formation of the Soviet Union. Germany, too, underwent drastic changes, with the abdication of the Kaiser and the formation of the Weimar Republic. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war and set the terms for the post-war order. However, many of the treaty's provisions, particularly those imposed on Germany, sowed the seeds of future conflict. The harsh reparations demanded of Germany, along with the loss of significant territories and military restrictions, created resentment that would later fuel the rise of Adolf Hitler and the outbreak of World War II. In addition to the creation of new nations, the map of Europe and the Middle East was redrawn. The collapse of empires and the principle of self-determination led to the creation of several new countries, but many of these new states were plagued by ethnic and political tensions that had been suppressed under imperial rule. For example, in the Balkans, newly formed Yugoslavia faced ethnic divisions that would later result in the conflicts of the 1990s. World War I had an indelible impact on society. The war had taken a tremendous toll on the soldiers who fought in it, as well as on the civilians who lived through it. The psychological scars left by the war were profound. For many soldiers, the horrors of trench warfare, where they faced constant shelling, gas attacks, and the destruction of their comrades, left them with what we now recognize as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. The term shell shock was used at the time to describe what we now understand as psychological trauma, and it became evident that the war had left a generation of men broken, both physically and emotionally. In addition to the physical and psychological wounds, World War I also led to significant social change. Women, who had been encouraged to enter the workforce during the war to replace the men who had gone off to fight, were reluctant to return to their previous roles after the war. This shift in gender roles paved the way for the expansion of women's rights, including the right to vote in many countries. The war also had a significant impact on art and culture. The disillusionment brought about by the war led to the rise of modernist movements in literature, art, and music. Writers, such as Erich Maria Remarque, who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front, and poets like Wilfred Owen captured the horrors and futility of war in their works. The war had shown that the world could no longer be understood in the same way, and art and literature began to reflect the fractured, chaotic nature of the New World Order. The legacy of World War I cannot be overstated. It set the stage for the upheaval and conflicts that would shape the 20th century, most notably World War II. The unresolved issues of the treaty, the rise of nationalist movements, the economic instability of the post-war period, and the psychological trauma experienced by millions of people all contributed to the tensions that would later explode in the Second World War. Moreover, the war marked the beginning of the decline of European dominance in global affairs. The United States, which had entered the war late and emerged as a key player on the world stage, would go on to become the dominant global power in the decades following the war. Meanwhile, European powers like Britain and France, weakened by the war, would eventually lose their empires in the mid-20th century, giving way to new superpowers like the United States and the Soviet Union. The legacy of the Great War, as it came to be known, is still felt today in many ways. The borders of modern-day Europe and the Middle East were shaped by the outcomes of World War I, and the political and cultural shifts initiated during the war continue to influence global affairs. As we reflect on the forgotten fronts of World War I, those beyond the Western Front and the famous battles, we realize that the impact of this global conflict was far-reaching. The war reshaped not only the political landscape but also the lives of millions of people around the world, and its legacy continues to shape our world to this day.